examples of the transcendental hero. And Whitman certainly qualifies as one, both in his lifestyle and his approach to art. A lot of Whitman's personal life makes their way into his poetry, particularly into Song of Myself. For example, he didn't get along with his father very well. He described him as manly, mean, and unjust. He didn't say much about his mother, except that she was quiet, mild, and clean. But he was enormously attached to her. He's in his late 50s when she dies, and both he and his brother are devastated by it. He has two brothers who died in an insane asylum. One went there as a result of alcoholism. The other had mental and emotional problems from the time he was young, and they eventually had to commit him. I think I might have mentioned this before, talking about the reform of mental institutions. So when he has that line in there about no longer about the guy being taken to the insane asylum, a confirmed case. The lunatic is carried at last to the asylum, a confirmed case. He will never sleep anymore as he did in the cot in his mother's bedroom. He's really talking about his brother-in-law. About his brother. His one brother became an alcoholic. He introduced his wife to alcoholism. She became an alcoholic, and because he couldn't support her and she couldn't support herself, she turned to prostitution. So as you'll see when we get to Whitman's attitudes on prostitution, they look like outlaw attitudes compared to those of the day, because he sees them in largely Marxian terms. He sees them as a result of economics, as opposed to the moralist view that prostitutes were evil women who lured good men into moral destruction. And probably nothing could have been further from the truth. I mean, the prostitutes stayed in one part of town, in the brothels or on the streets. Everybody knew where it was. You didn't stumble into that part of town by accident. And it wasn't like the hookers were in the suburbs going door to door. People ended up with hookers because they set out to go there. And yet the moralists acted as if they were really the aggressors when they weren't. Few, if any of them, were involved in prostitution because they liked sex. They were desperate. There weren't jobs for women. It was about the only thing you could do, except maybe school teacher. And if you had the looks and given a choice, you'd be a fool to take school teacher even today. And of course they didn't. Whitman has a sympathy for them that isn't generally felt, and although, again, it's another example of him being a transcendental hero because it's a 20th century attitude towards prostitution. But in the 19th century, again, the moralists were the ones who were setting the definition. Whitman seems like an outlaw to them, but in fact, he's really just somebody living in terms of a 20th century morality. His one sister suffered from acute melancholia, which is depression, and Whitman himself seems to have suffered from manic depression, a disease which is several hundred times more prevalent among writers than it is the rest of the population. Walt loves school when he's a kid, but he only gets to go up, I don't think he even gets to go up until the 8th grade. It's more like the 6th grade when he has to drop out. He was very big for his age, and so he walked kind of hunched over, trying to look smaller, and that carried on even into adulthood. When he dropped out, he was an apprentice. Despite not finishing high school, or really even junior high, for a year he was a teacher. A lot of writers in desperation turned to teaching in those days. Some of them were good and some of them weren't. Longfellow was outstanding at it. Thoreau was very good. Melville might have been good. Melville taught in an all-girls school. He was very good looking, and they asked him to leave the second year. Whitman wasn't very good as a teacher. Like Thoreau, he didn't believe in beating his students. Unlike Thoreau, he didn't get their respect and admiration as a result. They just became completely unruly and Whitman couldn't handle him, and so they fired Whitman partway through the year. Mostly, though, he's an apprentice to a printer. Early on, around 12 or so, some of his first writing appears in the newspaper. That's impressive, but not as impressive as it sounds now. Remember, there were more than 100 newspapers in New York City, which wasn't even a third the size that it is now. Every small town had at least one newspaper. Most had more than one. So getting work in the newspaper wasn't all that unlikely. Still, from 12 to 17 or so, he's both setting type and doing some freelance writing. When he's 22, he moves to New York and became a reporter. He gets enormously active in politics. He was probably a word healer. In those days, anybody could get a favor from the government. You didn't have to bribe politicians with hundreds of thousands of dollars in quote-unquote campaign contributions. If your brother was in trouble with the law, your cousin came over from the old country and couldn't find a job or had some trouble with his papers, you went to the ward healer and he fixed it up for you. In return for your vote, it was obviously a quid pro quo. You gave him something, he gave you something. Essentially, they bought your vote by doing you favors. And Whitman was in charge of that. He was probably also in charge of keeping track of who died in the precinct, because on election day, they rounded up all of the derelicts and gave them a drink and a half dollar and took them around to the polls and voted them under the name of dead people. So the guy in charge of that precinct had to have the list of dead people to give them when they brought in the truckload of drunks to vote. Now, although those things seem corrupt to us, they were perfectly acceptable practices within the way politics was done at the time. I mean, the average political rally, you could tell whether it was a Whig or a Democrat because of whether they served hard whiskey or whether they served hard cider. The idea basically was whoever got you the drunkest, that was who you voted for. So although Whitman may seem like a shady character, he really wasn't. Most of what he does was acceptable behavior for his time. And he liked people, and if you challenged Whitman on it, he would have said, look, the government is doing something for the people. Yes, the party expects your vote in return. Why shouldn't it? It's carrying out what the government is supposed to do, helping the people. Probably, corrupt as it was, we were probably a lot better off under the political system that Whitman helped to manage than we are now. I mean, you can't get a favor from the government or even service from the government without having a lot of money. Ordinary people could get favors back. And he loved meeting people. He was enormously outgoing. He gave a lot of speeches for people running for office. The speeches that he gave, when you read Song of Myself, it's really intended to be read out loud. It's oratorical. Emily Dickinson's poems aren't really meant to be read out loud. When you look at them, first of all, they're awfully hard to read out loud. When Whitman printed Song of Myself, we don't have them, but he had in certain places, you know those printed symbols like G clefs and asterisks and things like that? He would put a bunch of those in between certain words with spaces on both sides of them, a string of them, to indicate how long the pause was. Because when you give a public speech, there are times when you wait for the audience's reaction, and times when you wait for applause, and times when you just want a point to sink in so you don't say anything for a little while. And he used those as a kind of musical notation, which is something that you'll see Emily Dickinson doing and Edgar Allan Poe, that focus on the sound effects of poetry. Much more prominent among the transcendental heroes. So his oratorical style is also partly responsible for his poetic style. In New York, he's a hard news reporter. He's very active in politics. He's a dandy. He loved to wear nice clothes and show them off, which is what people did. There were a lot of outdoor restaurants. in New York City, and people got dressed up in their finest, and they went places to see and to be seen. And Whitman enjoyed that. There are disagreements about whether Whitman was bisexual when he went to New York, or if he was homosexual completely. Either way, he had an awfully good time there. He wrote this poem called City of Orgies. City of orgies, walks, and joys, city home that I have lived and sung in your midst will one day make you illustrious. Not the pageants of you, not your shifting tableaus, your spectacles repay me, not the interminable rows of your houses, nor the ships at the wharves, nor the processions in the streets, nor bright windows with goods in them, nor to converse with learned persons or bear my share in the soiree or feast. Not those, but as I pass on Manhattan, your frequent and swift flash of eyes, offering me love, offering response to my own, these repay me. Lovers, continual lovers only repay me. And I have to remember how uptight people were about sex at the time. That's a breakthrough poem. When people read poetry, they didn't expect any even hints of sex in it, let alone the kind of graphic descriptions you saw and may not have noticed because they don't seem that graphic to us, but for the times they were pretty graphic. In a poetry, there were certainly books with graphic descriptions of sex in them. Everybody knew who they were. Victorian times probably produced more pornography than any other time. But people knew what those books were. They went to them for that specific purpose. They didn't expect to find sex mentioned, and especially mentioned in a positive way, which is what Whitman always does. One thing you have to keep in mind about Whitman's sexuality is that it's an expression of the oversoul. The oversoul, remember, wants variety. It wants the many, and sex is how you get them. So to Whitman, sexuality was just one of the most obvious ways in which you could see the oversoul working in this world. He had also read a lot of Eastern philosophy, and in several Eastern religions, sex has a prominent place. It's not a shabby and dirty thing as it is with Christianity. So his attitudes are taken from there, but to many of his readers, he looks like an outlaw. But in fact, his attitude is even a little bit conservative for modern tastes. So he's living in terms of a 20th century morality, but maybe not quite a 21st century morality. In any case, he's having a great time in New York City. When he stays there for about 5 years, being a reporter and partying and being active in politics. Then he moves back to Brooklyn. His family had come originally from Long Island. His father was a failed farmer. He went to work as a carpenter in Brooklyn. The Navy Yard was in Brooklyn, but it was mainly rural. It hadn't really started to blossom yet. Whitman made most of his day job when he wasn't being an editor was that he would buy up a plot of land, build a house on it, live in the house while he finished the inside, he and the family, and then buy a second house and move to the second house, sell the first, then fix the second one up, move to the third. Almost anybody else who was either a carpenter or in real estate, when the boom hit Brooklyn, made a huge amount of money, but Whitman never did. Whitman was on the brink of poverty almost all of his life, and he doesn't even get anywhere near. He got to be notorious, but it's not till the end of his life where he could claim to have anything near fame. In any case, he's the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. It's a political newspaper, as are almost all of them. His appointment was almost certainly political. He does that for about 2 years, and in 1848, now we're 12 years before the Civil War, he gets fired for writing an anti-slavery editorial for an abolitionist newspaper. That's pretty hard to do. What he said was that when the slave catcher comes to take a slave back that you're helping escape to the north, take your gun and shoot him. Nobody was saying shoot the slave catcher. Whitman, again, is acting in terms of a future morality, but it's not long. I mean, you don't even have to go to 1860. Probably by 1855, people were saying oppose slavery with violence. So Whitman is again acting in terms of a future morality. This is a turning point in his life, because when he gets fired, he goes to New Orleans. There are disagreements about what exactly it was that changed Whitman around. He goes south as Walt Whitman, star reporter, and he comes back as Walt Whitman, the cosmic poet. And he spells cosmic with a K to indicate that he isn't talking about the physical cosmos, but about the cosmos of being, which is the oversoul. Remember, everybody is the oversoul? Well, that's the cosmos that he's talking about, and that's why he uses a K for it. Some critics have argued that it's the trip south. He's only there for a few months. He worked as assistant editor on the New Orleans Crescent. And then he came back up the Mississippi and across through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and back to New York. That having seen all the great variety of the country, he became inspired to become the Democratic voice, the voice of America. Other critics have argued that Whitman went south trying to be at least bisexual, and what he finds in New Orleans, now New Orleans was probably the most sophisticated city in America. Its upper crust, its aristocracy, are the Creoles, the French left over from before the Revolutionary War. They're a pretty tightly knit group. And so it's really a French city. Even today, it hardly seems like an American city. And it was known for its brothels, and it had a fairly large, almost above-ground homosexual population. Now, there was a sizable homosexual population in New York City, but it wasn't as, it was in the shadows. It was in the closet. New Orleans, it's really not. And this is the first time that Whitman sees other gay people who are not trying to hide their homosexuality, who are in fact proud of it, who accept themselves. And one group of critics says Whitman stopped trying to be bisexual, which he really wasn't, accepted his homosexuality. That takes an awful lot of pressure off him internally and allows him to become an artist. Another group says that no, he was homosexual when he went south, but he was ashamed of it. And when he got to New Orleans and he saw there were a lot of other gay people who weren't ashamed, that helped him out. He accepts himself and he comes back as the cosmic poet. In either case, when he comes back again, he gets another job as an editor, as a reporter, and then as an editor. As a reporter, he covers the Egyptian Museum in New York, and he meets a Dr. Abbott, who gets him interested in Egyptology, and that's where you get the idea of reincarnation that you see in Song of Myself. It appears several times, partly in terms of the grass. He talks about coming again in 1,000 years. At the very end of the poem ends with the idea of reincarnation. I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good help to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you. That symbol of the grass that appears throughout Song of Myself is that idea of rebirth. The grass dwindles down and seems to die, but it always comes back again. And so do people, as far as Whitman's concerned. And a lot of the transcendentalists did believe in reincarnation, largely under the argument that why would the oversoul open a unique vision of itself in the form of you and then close it down after a mere 70 years. It would take your vantage point and see itself all throughout its evolution throughout time. So a lot of his reincarnation comes from his Egyptology. In 1850, at the age of 31, Whitman has what might be considered a nervous breakdown. In any case, he's plunged into a crushing depression, and the trigger for this is the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And Whitman was a fanatical Democrat with both a little d and a capital D. He had enormous faith in the Democratic Party. But when the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, what the Fugitive Slave Act says is that when you see a slave, you not only aren't allowed to help him, which was under the old law, but you are required to return him to the person who owns them. In essence, it made everybody north of the Mason-Dixon line an unpaid slave catcher. That was a horrible betrayal of the principles that Whitman felt the Democratic Party stood for. And he was appalled. He couldn't believe that the party he believed in so strongly would sell out its principles like that. And that makes him enormously depressed. He quits his job. He withdraws from the world. He goes back home to Brooklyn to live with the family. For about a year, he doesn't go out. He doesn't see any of his old friends. He's not in New York at the restaurants and at pafs and places. He works as a carpenter. He says he worked real hard as a carpenter. His mother said he never got up before noon. You can see why he didn't get along with his father. His father's a carpenter. He's a working guy. It's 19th century. Probably he suspected that Walt was gay. And so there was a lot of arguments there about that unsaid secret that Walt has. Also, if Walt gets up at 12, he doesn't get to the job till 2. I mean, these were guys who were there when the sun came up and started hammering then. You show up at 2 o'clock and pretend that you've been working all day, you're going to annoy your brothers and your father. And so they had a lot of battles and disagreements about that. About a year later, though, he does make an appearance at the Brooklyn Art Union, where he talks about the artist as hero, as the savior of the community, and about the cosmic poet with a capital K. And he proposes himself as the cosmic poet. He talks about the democratic aesthetic, that what the cosmic poet would do would be to use America as symbolic of the oversoul. Remember, the oversoul is one. We're all the oversoul. And it's also many. It's also infinitely various. And America was seen as being the same way. It was made up of a great variety of peoples. But when they came here, they gave up their old culture and became American. They retained some parts of it. There was a variety of America, so it was both variety and unity. And America then was the best symbol we would have for the oversoul. The way America had been treated by poets was entirely different from what Walt Whitman does. I mean, Whitman wants to be the conscience. Most poems about America were either about the abstract idea of liberty and freedom, or they were about some famous battle, or they were about areas of the country, nature kind of poems. Nobody had given a realistic picture of America, warts and all. And that, of course, is exactly what Walt Whitman does. And to Walt, it's kind of like what Thoreau said about telling the government what's wrong with it so that it can change. He thought by giving America this picture of itself as it truly was, it would realize all of the discrepancies between the ideal of America, the home of the free, and what America really was like. And so he puts a lot of things in that almost just weren't found in poems before. Drug addicts and prostitutes and criminals and people who weren't mentioned in polite society. Whitman puts them into the poems because they existed. So he does a realistic view of the democratic voice. And to Whitman, unlike many people at the time, he believed that great variety of America, particularly in terms of its work. Remember, the Transcendentalists almost held work sacred. Show me your work and I will know you. That working class people were every bit as moral and every bit as good and every bit as creative as people who didn't work for a living or didn't work with their hands for a living. And so you see a lot of ordinary people at their work in this poem, which you didn't see in most other poems about America. And that's that democratic aesthetic that he's trying to develop. He's going to show America as it is. He admires it even for its flaws. But he wants to see those flaws corrected, and he thought they would be. Also, the song Myself is about, so the whole book, Leaves of Grass, is really about the oversoul. When Whitman talks about himself, and you see I all over the poem, he's not talking just about Walt Whitman. but as Walt Whitman, an expression of the oversoul. 4 years later, he brings out Leaves of Grass. And Leaves of Grass is the book in which Song of Myself appears. He has it's a completely new approach to poetry. Now, the book was burned. It was burned by moralists because of its attitudes towards sex. It was burned by poetry lovers because they considered it an insult to their intelligence. Prior to Whitman, poems rhymed and they had a fixed meter. Longfellow, the fireside poets, that's what people thought was poetry. Well, even without reading Whitman, if you just glance at the page, what can you see that's different than Longfellow?
There's no pattern to it.
There's no pattern to it. The lines go almost across. They look like prose. They don't have the same length. There's no rhyme in it. There's no fixed meter in it. There are none of the characteristics to it that people normally saw as poetry. And so the poetry lovers burned it. Whitman is breaking ground in a whole lot of new ways. What Emerson did for the construction of the essay, Whitman does to some extent with his notebook. You remember that Emerson kept a journal, and he would go and leaf through his journal and find everything he could find on self-reliance. And then he would take those quotes and try to work them into an essay as he happened to come to them. Whitman carries around a notebook with him from the time he goes south on, in which he jots down little phrases during the day. And it's those little phrases that he uses to build up the panoramic pictures which exist in Song of Myself. In fact, he invents the technique called cataloging. You notice that Whitman can't bring up a subject without creating a list about that subject. So when he mentions elections, he'll say elections and the makers of ballot boxes and the voters of ballot boxes and the stuffers of ballot boxes and the ballots themselves. And you get this whole long list of things associated with ballots or with voting or with elections. And he makes these lists. Now, when he first sent a number of the poems to Emerson, Emerson liked them, and for good reason. You have the voice of the oversoul in them. You have a poet, an American poet writing about Americans for Americans, which is exactly what Emerson said we needed. And you have that democratic aesthetic. You have a lot of formal innovations in the poem itself. That's all breaking new ground. The focus on I, everybody, to the transcendentalist, I is where it starts. You're the one who knows what's good. So naturally Emerson liked it, but it is not long after the book comes out that Emerson writes back to Whitman very angrily and denounces him. He says, I thought you were going to be a great poet, but you're nothing more than the maker of laundry lists. One of the reasons that he does that is because the rumors of Whitman's homosexuality circulated almost immediately with the book itself. Emerson never, of course, gets over having been a minister. Homosexuality is an unnatural act as far as he's concerned. Remember, this was a crime. Homosexuality, if you were homosexual, you would go to jail for that. That was a crime in itself. So it was dangerous to even admit it. So hardly anybody was in favor of it. There was no openly gay movement. So Emerson naturally dislikes it, and he doesn't want to be associated with Whitman because he's afraid everybody's going to say that's what transcendentalism, unnatural acts. Something's got to be done with that philosophy. To show you how much prejudice there was, Whitman himself, now when the book comes out, Whitman was, one of the ways that he's got a grasp of future morality is, like Franklin before him, he has a keen understanding of what image means. And he's always trying to create a public image for himself. And he realizes that the rumors about his homosexuality are going to be very damaging, so he circulates a rumor that when he was in New Orleans, he had a child out of wedlock with a Creole woman. It's possible. He was an assistant editor. He would have gone to social functions and charity functions. He might have met somebody from the upper crust. and maybe he had an affair with her, but it's not very likely. But you can see how, now remember, to have a child out of wedlock then was a tremendous scandal. So you can see how bad the accusations must have been about his homosexuality, that he would try to cover them up by putting out a scandal which proved that he was heterosexual. He also wrote anonymous reviews of Leaves of Grass, saying that it was the most wonderful poetry ever written, that America needed a cosmic poet, and this Walt Whitman was certainly him. He did everything he could to promote the book. He was an expert at self-promotion. Part of that, of course, from his background in politics. If he was around today, he would have gone on every talk show. He would have been on the Joe Franklin show, even, hawking his book. The book is almost immediately banned in Boston and Philadelphia, and in fact it's burned in both cities. What does that do to the sales of the book? You burn a book that has naughty passages in it.
Goes up.
Goes up. So everybody's reading Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman hoped for fame, but what he really got was notoriety. Among his innovations in Leaves of Grass is that he brought the book out 5 different times. And every time he brings the book out, he changes it. Now, this is a book that had gotten critical acclaim originally. The second time he brings it out, he changes the order of the poems. He takes some of them out. He revises poems even though people had liked them. Poets don't do that. Poets generally finish a work, put it out, and leave it that way. Walt Whitman on the frontispiece said, "Who touches this book touches a man." And when the man changed, the book had to change. So the book is really a series of books, even though the 3rd or 4th edition has some poems that weren't in it since the first. So poems come and go in and out of the book itself. That kind of revision was something nobody had done before, and I don't know that anybody's really done it since. So that's another of the innovations that Whitman brings to the poetry. He brings out the 2nd edition not long after the first. The first one doesn't even have his name on it. It has a picture of Walt Whitman with a slouch hat and a straw hanging out of his mouth, kind of leaning on a fence post. The next one, the picture is gone, because when he sent the poems to Emerson, Emerson sent them a letter back that said, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career." Now, 2nd edition of the book, it says, "By Walt Whitman." And on the frontispiece, it said, the picture you have, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career, Ralph Waldo Emerson." Now, if you got praise from Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's the arbiter of who the new writers are. Emerson was outraged. He wrote to him and said, "I sent you that in a private letter. You had no right to use it without my permission. Stop doing it." Whitman just ignored him. The praise by Emerson stays in there for quite a while. Whitman didn't care what Emerson thought. And if Emerson wrote a retraction, Whitman didn't care, because it doesn't matter what you say about me, just spell my name correctly. People would have read it and looked at his poetry again because Emerson had withdrawn his support from him. Things go along fairly well for him for a while, but when he hits 40, he gets fired for writing 2 editorials. Everything falls apart for him. He hits 40 and he brings out what's called the Midlife Crisis edition. And it seems another attack of that recurrent depression. Several things brought it on. One is that he turned 40. People didn't live as long then, and generally even now, what guys turn 40, what do they have? Midlife crisis. Red convertible, and they elope with the babysitter. Well, Whitman didn't have any babysitter, but he has a midlife crisis. And the reason guys do that is because they get to be 40, and no matter what they've achieved, it doesn't come close to the dreams of their youth. And so they see their life as a failure, and it seems like their last chance to grasp some kind of life at all, and they go off the deep end. And Whitman was the same. Whitman had expected that when Leaves of Grass came out and presented that picture of America, it was going to change America. America was going to free the slave overnight and start treating women as equals. And it didn't happen. His life work looked like a failure. It had brought him notoriety, but it hadn't really brought him any fame. So he looks like he's closing in on death. He hasn't achieved what he wants to achieve. His life is largely a failure. A long-term homosexual affair breaks up. You live with somebody a long time, it's the same as a marriage. If you know people going through divorce, generally for about 2 years, and it's not a pleasant divorce, and how many of them of those are there, they're kind of crazy for a while, and Whitman just loses it entirely. And he writes 2 editorials. The first one defends prostitutes. The problem is, it isn't, if Franklin had done it, Franklin would have written a humorous essay pointing out that the advantages to legalizing prostitution. Crime rate would go down, you could have some control over the health effects, women wouldn't be forced into it by necessity, the thieving that goes along with it wouldn't occur. Whitman attacks the moralists, saying that they're the ones who have made the life of the prostitute as miserable as it is. They're the one who degrades her and not the job itself, not what she does. That these supposedly Christian moralists have no sense of pity. That if there's a villain here at all, it's the men who seek them out and provide them custom, not the prostitutes themselves. So the moralists are up in arms about that, because again, they saw the prostitute as the victimizer of upstanding citizens, which of course they certainly weren't. Then he follows that up after the storm that creates with another editorial that says young people are entitled to a sex life before marriage. Both, of course, 20th century morality, but in the 19th century, outrageous ideas. And he gets fired for that, goes home, wrestles with his depression for a while, brings out in 1860 the midlife crisis edition of Leaves of Grass. Then the Civil War breaks out, and his brother is wounded, he goes to nurse him back to health. He acts as a male nurse. He doesn't do a lot of what we would consider nursing. He probably emptied bedpans, he made beds. Mostly he wrote letters home for the soldiers, he played checkers with them, he talked to them, he gave them a shoulder to cry on. He was probably involved, because he did see 3 of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, in the care, if you want to call it that, of the wounded. What was the standard care of the wounded if you weren't shot in the head or the abdomen? If you got shot in the arm or the leg? Amputation. And they ran out of, morphine was almost non-existent, they ran out of alcohol. And if you're giving somebody alcohol as an anesthetic, by the time they don't care that their leg's being cut off, they're pretty close to death by alcohol poisoning. Most of the time, that idea about bite the bullet, they got a cartridge, they put it between your teeth, a guy held your head, 5 other guys grabbed your arms and legs, and a big burly guy with a saw took your leg off. Whitman was probably one of those guys who held people down. And when he talks about he sees what the surgeon removes, it drops horribly in the pail, that's a line that was added after his Civil War experience. When the war is over, there were a lot of veterans hospitals for the wounded around Washington, D.C. Whitman comes back, gets a political job. It's almost a no-show job, and spends most of his time in the hospitals. While he's there, he's working for the War Department. Stanton, the Secretary of War, who I personally suspect of having a large hand in the Lincoln assassination, even though he was attacked himself, but he was clever enough to do that as a cover-up. In any case, Stanton, who was not a nice guy, looks at his payroll and says, Walter Whitman, is that guy that wrote the dirty poetry a few years back? And when he finds out it is, he fires Whitman. Now, Whitman's friends try to get him his job back, and in the process, William Day O'Connor, a friend of his, writes a pamphlet called The Good Gray Poet. And he points out that, yes, Whitman had written some wild stuff in his youth, but that he had matured since then. He had recently written 2 of the most popular poems in America, both about Lincoln's assassination, Oh, Captain, My Captain, and When Lilacs Last and the Dooryards Bloom. And this was a patriot now. And he was the good gray poet. And from what students tell me, that's generally the way that he's taught in high school, as the good gray poet, the long gray beard and the long gray hair and the slouch hat. And no mention of his there's no mention of his homosexuality. Stanton still doesn't take him back. They get him a job in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Again, it's mostly a no-show job. The British hear he's living in poverty, and he was very big in England. They can't imagine America's greatest poet is starving to death, so they take up a collection for him. It's held up for about 2 years by William Randolph Hearst, the guy who owns the newspaper and is generally considered to be responsible for the Spanish-American War in order to sell newspapers. And he doesn't want this pervert getting this money, so he manages to stop it for a while. But eventually Whitman gets the pension. It's not a lot of money. It allows him and his brother to buy a house in Camden, a small house, and to take one last trip around America. Not all that long after that, he has a stroke. He rents the job out, so he still gets part of the salary, goes to live with his brother. He's going blind, and about the happiest part of it, they still don't have very much money. But on Whitman's birthday, because Camden never had anybody even notorious live there, so they're overjoyed to have somebody people have heard of. On Whitman's birthday, they have a big parade that stops in front of Whitman's house, and Whitman comes out and gets to read some poetry. Largely, the later you go look at Whitman's verse, the more pessimistic it starts to become. Initially, it's incredibly optimistic because it's dealing with the oversoul, and the idea that this variety eventually is the oversoul unfolding. A guy named Noguchi from Princeton, a graduate student, went to write a dissertation and interviewed Whitman. When he went to Whitman's house, there were piles of open books stacked up. Remember, Whitman's gone blind, so he asked him, well, why are the books like that? Whitman says, oh, I start to read, my eyes blur up, I'm keeping them from when my eyes get good again. So even at the end, Whitman hadn't entirely lost his optimism. When you look at Song of Myself, one of the things is that throughout you'll see, well, let's look at the technique first. Whitman does get rid of rhyme. But he doesn't get rid of repetition. All rhyme is the repetition of end sounds, traditionally at the end of the line. Whitman will repeat whole lines, or he'll begin whole lines the same way. If you look down around line 30, you have 3 lines in a row with have you, have you, have you. Then he likes to set up pairs of opposites, because remember that's what the oversoul is set up pairs of opposites. Not mutually exclusive categories, but 2 different aspects of the same force, the oversoul. So he likes to set those pairs up. And you have, you shall possess, you shall no longer, you shall not, you shall. And then the lines all end with, in the next stanza, the lines all end with the beginning or the end, and then there is now. And there are internal repetitions. I have heard what the talkers were talking. The talk of the beginning and the end. But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There never was any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age, paired opposites, than there is now. And never will be any more, repetition from the first line, perfection, a rhyme with inception, than there is now, nor any more, repetition of the second line, heaven or hell, paired opposites, than there is now. If you look over at the end of section 30, you see him doing that technique of beginning the lines with the same word. From line 660 on. 5 lines in a row with and, then an I believe, then 6 more ands, then I find, 2 more ands and a but, 9 lines beginning with in vain, then with a bunch of verbs, I follow, I think, I stand, then they do not, they do not, they do not one, not one, not one. Over around line 730, you have 4 lines beginning with where in a row, 5 with over, 6 with where, then a wherever, 8 more with where, 3 with upon. Then we have 15 lines in a row beginning with where. 3 with through, and 5 with please. So he's using repetition, he's using it in a different way than anybody had ever used it before. Breakthroughs in technique are tantamount to breakthroughs in morality. Art is a reflection. It's like, I think it's, Byron says, beauty is all we know of truth, and all we need to know. And art is a form of beauty. So when you make changes in art, you make changes and insights into the truth. And this is one of the ways that he changes it. We get the long lines to show he's acting in terms of future morality. Whitman's the first one to write in free verse, unrhymed and unmetered poetry. 99% of all the poetry published in America now is written in free verse. It's hard to get a traditional rhymed poem with rhyme and fixed meter published. So he saw in terms of where things were going even in that respect. That technique of cataloging and an example of the democratic voice you can see in a number of places in the poem, especially section 15, where you get a whole series, one after another. This is almost what I think of as Whitman's democratic calendar. Norman Rockwell, who did the All-American pictures and the covers of Post for a long time, could have had 20 years worth of calendars if he had just read Walt Whitman and done one line for each month. Let's take a break until 8:30, and then I will talk even faster. So if you look at section 15, you can see Whitman's Americana calendar. You'll notice that he mixes. Almost everybody is doing something. Basically, that's their job. He tries to pick out, what he does is he needs to have the same quality that a sketch writer needs. A sketch writer's guy who makes word pictures, usually of places or of people. And the sketch writer goes to what's called the quintessential detail, the detail of the fifth essence, the one detail that gives you the whole picture. And Whitman is particularly good at being able to find that one detail. And then, of course, he stacks up those details one after another to give you the whole broad picture, in this case, of America. The carpenter dresses his plank. The tongue of his foreplane whistles its wild ascending lisp. Now, of all the stuff he could have said about carpentry, the sound of that piece of wood peeling up when you push a plane down it gives you the whole picture. The married and unmarried children ride home to their Thanksgiving dinner. Why Thanksgiving dinner? What's it got to do with America? American holiday. We're the only one that celebrates Thanksgiving. Then you have the pilot, the mate, the duck shooter, the deacons. They're all positive images. Then the first negative one we get, the spinning girl retreats and advances to the hum of the big wheel. She doesn't seem to be overworked, though, so that's probably also a positive image. But then we get the lunatic. After the lunatic being carried off, we get the jour printer with gray head and gaunt jaw, works at his case. He turns his quid of tobacco while his eyes blur with the manuscript. His guy who sets type. His case is what he would hold the letters in. And his eyes are starting to blur. First of all, he chews tobacco. There wasn't a poem before about America with the people chewing tobacco in it, even though a large majority of Americans did chew tobacco. What's the significance of his eyes blurring? He's a jour printer. He works by the day. This guy is getting old. He's losing his eyesight. What happens to him when he loses it? He's gone. He's out of work. There's no Social Security. There's no unemployment. He's on the street. So it's a negative image of America, but also one that's happening all over the place in America. The malformed limbs are tied to the surgeon's table. What is removed drops horribly in a pail. The quadroon girl is sold at auction. Quadroon 1. I think quadroon is 1/16 black. No, 1/4. and she's still sold at auction. The drunkard nods by the barroom stove. The machinist rolls up his sleeves. The policeman travels his beat. The gatekeeper marks who passed. So we go back to the positive images again. If you look on the next page, all of the lines in that section are all about America. And he does it by showing you the people. He shows you ordinary people. He shows you doing things that they would do. The bride unrumples her white dress. The minute hand of the clock moves slowly. Remember, in those days, getting married was the epitome of a woman's life. This is what all women wanted to do. And so he takes that moment and the two things that he says about it. She unrumples her dress and the minute hand of the clock moving slowly. The two details that give you the whole picture. The opium eater reclines with rigid head and just opened lips. No opium, no drug addicts in American poetry before Walt Whitman. The prostitute draggles her shawl. Her bonnet bobs on her tipsy and pimpled neck. What's tipsy mean? Drunk. Anybody know why her neck is pimpled? Syphilis. The crowd laughs at her. There wasn't a lot of kissing involved in their relationships. The crowd laugh at her blackguard oaths. The men jeer and wink to each other. Miserable. I do not laugh at your oaths nor jeer you. She's drunk. The men make fun of her. She swears at them. Women didn't swear in those days. They think that's hilarious. Whitman thinks it's terrible because he knows his sister was forced into that life because it was the only way to stay alive. But after those negative images, we go back to the positive again. The president holding a cabinet council surrounded by the great secretaries. Thank you. On the piazza walk three matrons, stately and friendly with twined arms. And he mixes those in because, remember, the negative and the positive go together to make the oversoul. Also in 16, you not only get the pairs of opposites, but you get them dealing with America as the one made out of the many, the different regions of America. I am of the old and the young, of the foolish as much as the wise, regardless of others, ever regardful of others. Maternal as well as paternal, a child as well as a man, stuffed with the stuff that is coarse and stuffed with the stuff that is fine. There's another example of Whitman's innovation. Stuff, it's a slang word. You wouldn't find that. Or at the end when he says, I sound my barbaric yacht over the roof of the world. You wouldn't have found the word yacht in a poem. Whitman brings the language of the people into the poem as well. One of the nation of many nations. Again, the one and the many. Unity of variety. The smallest the same and the largest the same. A southerner as soon as a northerner. A planter, nonchalant, hospitable. Down by the Oconee I live. A Yankee bound my way ready for trade. My joints the limberest joints on earth and the sternest joints on earth. A Kentuckian walking the valley of the Elkhorn in my deerskin leggings. A Louisianan or Georgian. A boatman over lakes or bays or along coasts. A Hoosier, Badger, Buckeye. At home in Canadian snowshoes or up in the bush. Or with fishermen off Newfoundland. At home in the fleece of ice boats, sailing with the rest and tacky. At home in the hills of Vermont or in the woods of Maine. Or the Texan ranch. Comrade of Californians. Comrade of free Northwesterners, loving their big proportions. Comrade of raftsmen and coalmen, comrade of all who shake hands and welcome to drink and meat. A learner with the simplest, a teacher of the thoughtfulest. A novice beginning, yet experienced of myriad seasons. Of every hue and caste am I, of every rank and religion, a farmer, mechanic, artist, gentleman, sailor, Quaker, prisoner. You notice you have that series of positive images. Prisoner. Prisoners don't usually appear in a poem. Fancy man. Anybody know what a fancy man is? It's a pimp. Rowdy, lawyer, physician, priest. So it mixes those negative and positive. It gives you the big picture of America as it is. He talks about playing marches for. I play not marches for accepted victors only. I play marches for conquered and slain persons. Have you heard it was good to gain the day? I also say it is good to fall. Battles are lost in the same spirit in which they are won. I beat and pound for the dead. I blow my embouchures the loudest and gayest for them. Thieves to those who have failed. to those whose war vessels sank in the sea, and to those themselves who sank in the sea, and all the generals that lost engagements, and all the overcome heroes, and the numberless unknown heroes equal to the greatest heroes known. Most of the time the poet writes about the winner. Whitman says that people lose with the same heroism that they win. Sometimes it's only dumb luck. So again, he likes to set things on their end, and particularly likes to see takes the side of the underdog. Self-love, having pried through strata and analyzed to a hair, counseled with doctors and calculated close, I find no sweeter fat than sticks to my bones. In all the people I see myself, none more and not one a barley corn less. And a good or bad I say of myself, I say of them. I am the poet of the body, I am the poet of the soul. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man. And I say it is great to be a woman as to be a man. I say there is nothing greater than the mother of men. Walt Whitman, a cosmos, again with a capital K. Of Manhattan the sun, turbulent, fleshy, sensual, eating, drinking, breeding, no sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, or more modest than immodest. Unscrew the locks from the doors, unscrews the doors themselves from their jambs. Whoever degrades another degrades me, and whatever is done or said returns to me at last. And that's the voice of the oversoul. Whatever is done to anybody is done to the oversoul. Through me, forbidden voices, voices of sexes and lusts, voices veiled, and I remove the veil, voices indecent by me, clarified and transfigured. I do not press my finger across my mouth. I don't tell anybody shush. I keep as delicate around the bowels as around the head and heart. Copulation is no more rank to me than death is. And he says, when he talks about death, he talks about endless promotion. The death never exists but to lead forth life. I believe in the flesh and the appetites. Seeing, hearing, feeling are miracles, and each part and tag in me is a miracle. Divine am I, inside and out, and I make holy whatever I touch or am touched from. The scent of these armpits, aroma finer than prayer. This head more than churches, Bibles, and all creeds. Well, you can see why the ministers got upset about that. Scent of these armpits, aroma finer than prayer. Because he is the oversoul, not just because he's Walt Whitman. And so every part of him is wonderful. When it comes to the sensuality that upset them so much, you have some pretty graphic, from their standards, examples of it. Before we look at that, though, look at the very opening line of Song of Myself. You can see why Emerson would have liked it. I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Everybody is part of the oversoul. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease and observe a spear of summer grass. And of course the grass comes back over and over again throughout the poem. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, from this air. Born here of parents the same, from parents the same and their parents the same. Remember Emerson said we need a literature by Americans, for Americans, about Americans. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. A little bit further down, nature without check with original energy. That one of the marks of the transcendental hero was his natural vitality. The sensuality and the sexuality come in pretty early in the poem, beginning in number 2. Houses and rooms are full of perfumes. The shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation will intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. What kind of houses would be filled with perfumes? Brothels, whorehouses. So, and you didn't see a whorehouse in a poem for decent people in the 19th century, but is it part of America? Absolutely. There was one in every small town, and everybody knew where it was, and every woman in town pretended she didn't. But when her husband disappeared, she knew where to go and look. It wasn't because all husbands... Men hung out there generally. Not necessarily be with the hookers, but because it was one place no decent woman would come under any circumstances. So they could play cards and swear and drink, and nobody was going to come and drag them out to go home. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It is no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I am in love with it. I will go to the bank by the woods and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. So Whitman plans to go to the woods and take off all his clothes and run around so he can be in contact with the air. This would be considered bizarre even today. Imagine how bizarre at a time when people didn't take their clothes off in public. Well, I mean, if you look at the television, people are always taking their clothes off. The newspapers are full with the magazines. But then, I mean, people were married 30 years, had 11 children, never saw one another naked. And Whitman's talking about running around naked in the woods. What he's really saying there, though, is when he takes off the clothes, he will be natural man. He'll be undisguised and naked. You'll be able to see him for the oversoul. It's the clothes that make us make distinctions between one another. Also, when it comes to sensuality, this upset them. Well, before we even do that, here's the oversoul again. Urge and urge and urge, always the procreate urge of the world. Out of the dimness, opposite equals advance. Always substance, always increase, always sex, always a knit of identity, always distinction, always a breed of life. It's the oversoul that pushes us towards becoming more and more people. As the hugging and loving bedfellow sleeps at my side through the night and withdraws at peep of day with stealthy tread. Hugging and loving bedfellow? Is this a woman? Probably not. Why does the guy disappear at morning? They'll go to jail if they're caught together. So the guy leaves. It's just a casual affair, which of course would have been anathema to the 19th century, even if we were heterosexual. Should I postpone my acceptation and realization and scream at my eyes if they turn from gazing down the road after, where his lover's gone, and forthwith cipher and show me to a set exactly the value of one and exactly the value of two, and which is ahead? Should I blame myself because as one lover departs, I look up the road for the next one coming along? Which again, the 19th century would have seen it as promiscuity, even if he were talking about women. This is the two sections that upset them the most. I mind how once we lay such a transparent summer morning, how you settled your head athwart my hips, athwart means across, and gently turned over upon me, and parted the shirt from my bosom bone, and plunged your tongue to my bare stripped heart, and reached till you felt my beard, and reached till you held my feet. Well, if you lay your head across somebody's hips and turn over on them, what's going on? An act which is still illegal in Georgia and several other southern states, even between married couples. And this doesn't say this is a man and a woman. You got to wait till the 19th century before you get oral sex described in a poem. This doesn't seem all that graphic to us. I don't imagine any of you read it to your significant others to stimulate them in any way. But in the 19th century, this was like turning on the Disney Channel, and right in the middle of Benji Come Home, you got the crucial 15 seconds of a XXX movie. This was startling to them. But much as that offended them, this one offended them even more. Section 11. 28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men and all so friendly. 28 guys go swimming. What do they wear? Nothing. This is 28 naked guys. 28 years of womanly life and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. Who's the 29th bather? The woman. Women weren't supposed to have any interest in sex. She not only has it, she watches naked men bathing, and she fantasizes about getting naked and joining them, 28 of them. This is unheard of. Anybody know why he makes her, first of all, 28 years old? Because by then she's a confirmed old maid. She's never going to get married, so she's supposed to have no interest in the sex whatsoever. And she's watching the naked guys. And he makes her rich, Because remember, rich people were supposed to have morality. Yes, some working class woman might look at 28 naked men, but no decent woman can. So he makes her rich. He says this is what all women are like. Again, a vision into the 20th century. 19th century didn't accept that women had a sexuality. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed over their bodies. An unseen hand passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. Whose hand? Hers. She's becoming the sexual aggressor. Women didn't do that in those days. This is about as erotic can it gets. And if their hand descends tremblingly from their temples, but if it's on their ribs going south, the young men float on their backs while their white bellies bulge to the sun. Whitman doesn't generally use euphemisms, and I'm not sure in the 1855 edition that it was their bellies that bulged to the sun. Typical guys, though, they do not ask who seizes fast of them. They don't ask who grabs hold of them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. If she's bent over them, her breast will be pendant. They do not ask whom they souse with spray. He's not talking about splashing her with water there either. This is as graphic a description of sexuality as you're going to get. It's a 19th century orgy, and it's in the middle of what's supposed to be a legitimate poem. And that, to many of the people reading it, makes Whitman look like an outlaw. I'm trying to see here if I missed any of the characteristics of Whitman that made him... No, pretty much covered all. Anybody make questions on Whitman?